Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us. We are very pleased today to have Mark and Giulia Luckach talking about their personal journey together. They met at 18, were married at 24, and today they will share how they have learned to make their marriage thrive. Mark is a teacher and the author of the best-selling memoir, My Lovely Wife in the Psych Ward. He has also written for the New York Times Modern Love column and again in a piece for Pacific Standard magazine, which happened to be the magazine's most read article in 2015. Giulia is a marketing director at an American corporation, and of course, they are both mom and dad to their son. We welcome you, Mark and Giulia. Thank you again for being with us and sharing with us today.
Morning, Debbie. Thank you so much for having us today.
Thank you so much. Such an honor.
So we're going to jump right in. As Debbie said in her intro, we're Mark and Giulia. I want to sort of start with a caveat to the audience that we are not experts, we're not researchers, and so our presentation is mostly about our personal narrative. So it's a lot of pictures of the two of us as compared to charts and data. Also, we're focusing our talk around our relationship between the two of us and how Giulia's bipolar diagnosis has impacted it and how we've learned to work through it. There's a couple things we won't be talking about too much. We're not going to talk a ton about the specifics of medication. We're also not going to be talking too much about parenting, which is, I think, another huge topic that we could be addressing, but we really, I think one of the reasons that people have resonated with our book so far, and also with some of the articles I've written in the past, is because the question of how mental illness impacts a romantic relationship is something that so many people face and experience, but there's not a lot of discussion around it. And so that's really what the thrust of our talk is today. So to jump in, this is us on the weekend we got engaged when we were 23 years old. Babies, basically. Giulia and I met the first week of college. We went to school in DC and kind of fell in love immediately and very easily. And I think it was already within a few months of being together that we kind of saw that we were probably going to be part of each other's lives for the rest of our lives. We graduated. I moved to Baltimore. Giulia moved to New York. We did long distance for 2 years. After 1 year, I said, this stinks. I want to get married to this girl and like live together and start our life together and stop commuting up to New York every weekend. So this is, again, the photo from the weekend where we got engaged. And we got married when we were 24, and literally the next day got on an airplane and moved to California. And there we kind of established what felt like a fairy tale life together, where we really had been already living a lot of happily ever after moments and just sort of hoped and expected that that's what it was going to be like the rest of the way. You know, I was teaching high school history. Giulia was in a job that she loved. And then after 3 years out in California when we were 27, things took a pretty unexpected turn. And I'm going to hand it over to Giulia to sort of narrate what that felt like for her. And then, yeah.
Great. So it was actually July of 2009 when I started a new job. So exactly 8 years ago. And it was this hip, local San Francisco company where I really wanted to impress my boss, impress my peers. And I knew I could do a good job. I was very much an overachiever. I was always a straight A student at Georgetown, and I knew I could kind of walk in and do a killer job. Well, that's not exactly what happened. So I remember going to work, and within just the first couple of weeks, like the second week, I was reading emails, and it would take me almost like 2 to 3 hours to draft a response. This is very much, you know, unlike me. And I remember calling Mark and being like, hey, can you review this email for me? And it was a really basic email, like, yes, I'll be working on the budgeting this week, something very simple. And yet I could not hit the send button. And I remember waking up in the morning not wanting to go to work. Like, this had never happened before. Just the constant pacing and thoughts that kept coming in my head that I wasn't good enough for this, that I couldn't succeed at this. And slowly, by the end of July and early August, I stopped sleeping. I was so anxious that at night I would just be awake for the entire night, hours and hours, days after days. I couldn't sleep. I would put listening meditation tapes on and nothing would do the trick. I lost my appetite, and that's when I got really scared. And I went and saw a psychiatrist, and they let me know that I had to go on antidepressants. To put in perspective, at the time I had no history of mental illness. I didn't even know what depression was. I thought it was a weakness to take any sort of medication for the mind, and I was really against it at the time. But I went home with these pills, and I remember getting on Skype with my mom and telling her, "Mom, I have this feeling that I want to take all these pills. Like, I want to kill myself. I don't want to deal with these feelings that are coming up for the first time in my 27 years of life. Like, I am not comfortable. I need to end this now." And that's when my dad flew out from Vienna. You know, that's a big deal when your father flies across the world to make sure his baby girl is okay. And I wasn't okay. I actually ended up getting hospitalized for 23 days in the psych ward in early September. And it was the most terrifying experience of my life. I'd never been in the psych ward before, and that experience changed me really forever. So I'm going to pass it on to Mark, who's going to speak about the first episode and visiting me in the psych ward those 23 days.
Yeah, I think that Giulia kind of, I think she did a good job of explaining just how unexpected this was for us, you know? And it was at this moment that I felt like Giulia and my path started to diverge a little bit, because she was the one experiencing the feelings, but I was the one I was trying to help. Like, while she's up at night with these meditation tapes on, I'm up awake with her, and I was trying to, like, do a massage and say comforting things, and, you know, kind of troubleshoot these issues together. And, like, I was really trying to help, but I didn't know how to help, and I felt really frustrated, and I felt really scared. I mean, Giulia, to give you some context, Giulia was 0.01, her GPA was 0.01 away from being the valedictorian of her high school. And all throughout college, she had these incredible internships. And meanwhile, I was, like, going and living at the beach and waiting tables and, like, surfing all day. And so she was the really ambitious, successful one. And I was the more just, like, dreamer, let it be, just kind of float along, enjoy the ride kind of guy. And yet here she was, all of a sudden, her ambition and her confidence came to a screeching halt. And I was just like, "You're tired, just go to sleep. You don't want to write this email, just do it," you know? And I realized, looking back, that I wasn't especially patient, because I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know how to support her. And so this slide into what we learned was psychosis was really rapid. I mean, between Giulia starting her job, it was only 6 weeks later that she was in the hospital on an involuntary hold, where they held her for 3 days and then extended her hold for a duration of 23 days. And that time was just, I don't think I've ever felt more alone in my life. I've never felt more uncertain and scared. I did not know what was happening, and I think hardest of all, I didn't know what was going to happen next. You know, I was trying to just focus on where we were in the moment, but my mind kept racing ahead to, like, well, what does this mean for our future? Like, is she going to return to health, or is this what it's going to be like for the rest of our lives? I mean, we're only 27, you know, we're still super young. Is this what the next 40 years are going to be? Are we ever going to be able to have kids? Is she ever going to be able to return to work? And I think one of the hardest parts about it all was that if you're married or in a serious relationship, when you go through your biggest crises, your obvious instinct is to turn to the person in that relationship, right? Like if, for example, it was a sibling of mine who got sick, then I would be processing that with my wife, Giulia. But since it was my wife who was sick and she was so delusional and psychotic and anxious that I couldn't talk to her about any of this stuff, I just kind of had to wrestle with all these questions on my own and they definitely haunted me, and it was really, really emotionally difficult to get through that. But ultimately, after being, filled up with a lot of antipsychotic medication, Giulia was discharged from the hospital. And our lives once again changed pretty dramatically, because as lonely as her time in the hospital felt for me, I was only allowed to visit her for 90 minutes a day. Now all of a sudden, her and her illness were my 24/7, because she was at home with me and pretty much only me. And it was pretty much up to the two of us to try to make it through each day. So, and that's where the depression side of her bipolar really came out. The hospital was when she was psychotic, which is how Giulia experiences mania. But then post-hospital is where the depression settled in. So Giulia's going to kind of talk through what that first episode of depression was like for her.
So having been in the psych ward for 23 days and really feeling like, it was a place where I couldn't really get out. Like I couldn't leave. That was my main goal, was to leave the psych ward, get out of here. Like I can't be in here. And it was the scariest times of my life. And I come from a Catholic background. I do believe in God. And these were I had spiritual delusions where I really believed I was the root of all evil. And I needed to be destroyed ultimately. And for someone to think that about themselves, to really feel like they shouldn't exist, is so heart-wrenching to the soul, to my being, that when I was released, I didn't want to live. I told Mark so many times, like, after that experience, I can't go on. I can't go on with my life. Nothing will ever be the same. It felt in a way like my old self was destroyed and this new person was created, and I wasn't ready to face this new life, having known what the psych ward is and what mental illness is and what psychosis is. And so I dove into a deep depression where I was attending, it's called IOP, Intensive Outpatient Care. It was from 9 to 12 every day, and I would go, and it was usually a 4 to 6 week program, and I found myself there for 9 months because the doctors and the psychiatrists were just not seeing the improvements, and they wanted to keep me safe ultimately and keep me going there every single day for 9 months. So I really felt like that time was when I was most suicidal, when I would talk to Mark and really picture my death and telling him, look, you have to move on. You have to find a wife after I kill myself. You have to basically get the Vespa keys from the Vespa after I leave the scooter at the Golden Gate Bridge, because I'm going to jump. It was really a scary time for us as a couple. And as individuals, and it took a lot of time for me to get out of this deep sadness, so I'm going to pass it on to Mark, who's going to really talk about our marriage after this long haul of depression and the negative impact it really had on us as a couple.
Yeah, because Giulia said that her depression, suicidal, was hard on us, but in truth, I don't actually. She was so fixated, she was so consumed by her depression that I think in the moment she wasn't really aware of the toll it was taking on our relationship. It was just so personal for her. And so those days, which, as Giulia said, stretched on for 9 months, were really, it was a very heavy caregiving burden for me. I was responsible for keeping her safe. She didn't like taking the medication she was prescribed, but she also desperately wanted to overdose on it, so I would have to hide the pills throughout the house and change up the hiding places. She didn't really want to do anything. mostly just wanted to stay in bed all day. So I would kind of plan out what felt like, hopefully, a rewarding way to spend our time with stuff like I signed us up for art classes for adults, and we'd go to yoga sometimes, or take our dog for a walk on the beach, as you can see from this picture, which my dad took of us when we were when he was visiting once. When we were, this was like one of the thousands of beach walks we did in our neighborhood in San Francisco. And you can see from the weather, we lived in a kind of ocean beach there, can get pretty foggy, and it really matched our mood, you know, that we just felt like we were kind of stuck and wandering around not knowing what was going on. And so this sense of loneliness that I felt when she was hospitalized became even more pervasive when she was home, which was really paradoxical, because here I was spending all day with her. You know, IOP 3 days a week for 3 hours. That's 9 hours. Otherwise, the rest of the time we were together. And yet, Giulia on her medication was pretty non-responsive and non-communicative. So it was more like me keeping a steady stream of just like blabber going on of like, oh, let's talk about this, just to try to keep her mind engaged in where we were, you know? And then after this like prolonged science experiment of them tweaking different medications, all of a sudden the depression was gone and Giulia was back. And we felt like, okay, is that it? Like, are we done with this thing? It was almost a year. It was horrifying and deeply traumatizing for both of us, but it seemed like it was over. And actually, that's what Giulia didn't get the bipolar diagnosis during her first episode. During the first episode, they called it major depression with psychotic features. And it wasn't until her second episode, 3 years after that, that they upgraded her diagnosis to bipolar 1. And then she did have a third episode, again, 2 years after the second. And so where we are now is that Giulia has been hospitalized 3 times. She's gone through 3 bouts of what feels like this almost predictable pattern at this point, where it's psychosis for about a month, and then depression for, I don't know, 5 to 9 months. And after the first episode, when she was better, I sort of expected, yay, we're done. It's over. Let's just like have fun now. That's what I was anticipating. And that's certainly what Giulia was anticipating. But instead, I ended up sinking into kind of like a post-caregiving depression of my own. And I think that's where we really began to experience just how much of a strain this put on our marriage, you know? I mean, speaking candidly, I felt unappreciated. I felt like I had essentially sacrificed so much of myself. I had stopped working for an extended period of time. I had almost no contact with friends. I was doing really nothing for myself for almost a year. And I didn't necessarily feel like that was validated by Giulia. I don't think she quite understood the scope of what that was. Because like I said earlier, her experience of her depression was so consuming that it really put blinders on her. You know, she didn't really stop and think like what this felt like for me, you know? And so unfortunately, coming out of the first episode, I was resentful, you know, and I didn't like feeling that way. I was like, what am I doing here? Like, we're better. Why am I being so why am I being so needy? You know, and I saw a therapist throughout this, and she kind of helped explain, like, this makes total sense. You basically had to bottle up these feelings for a year, and now they're coming out in ways you don't want them to come out. But I know that me, who's usually a pretty upbeat, happy-go-lucky guy, once Giulia came out of her depression, I don't think I've ever felt less in control of my own feelings. And so I needed, coming out of that, this sense of validation. Giulia, meanwhile, had an entirely different experience of like how this had a negative impact on our relationship.
Yeah, during that time, I really felt like Mark was trying to control every parts of me. I remember like him, besides, hiding the pills or giving me the pills or telling me when to take the pills or not to take the pills. Me and my friend who I actually had met at the hospital, became one of my best friends. We did refer to Mark as a pill Nazi, and at the time it was like a big joke, and I could see how hurtful that is now, that term, to call your husband, who's really taking care of you, making sure that you're safe, a pill Nazi. But that is, at the time, how I viewed him. There was such like anger that I had towards Mark. Like, he couldn't really understand like what I had been through, and yet he was trying in every way to control every part of me and my happiness. Like, I wanted to be free. I wanted to remember one night I wanted to attend a concert with a friend, and he's like, there's no way you're driving to the East Bay for a concert. You're staying home, Like, I had no freedom at the time. And looking back at it now, it makes sense to me. It makes sense to me the way that Mark behaved. But in the midst of it, right after my depression, it was to the point where I just wanted to like get out and just and travel or anything to get out of that San Francisco house, like with Mark, and feeling so controlled and so uncontrolled in life in general. So now we're going to kind of talk a little bit about our everyday life, what it's like, for me being bipolar, and what we're doing together, and how we're really planning for the future with the fact that I will always be bipolar. I will always have the bipolar diagnosis, and how can we live in a way that feels like very fulfilling and feels like, we're still, achieving those dreams that we set out to achieve when we were 24 years old.
Yeah, so this is a picture of our family, and this is like the thrust of the talk here. Like, what did we learn? How have we, as a couple, learned coping strategies to stay together and to make it that we were able to come from Giulia being hospitalized to, thankfully, us being able to become parents together and kind of get back on that happily ever after track that we felt when we were in our 20s. And I think there's a lot of I think we learned a lot of important things. At the core, I realized that caregiving, they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? And like Giulia, she said she gets it looking back that I was trying to do what was right, and yet at the time it felt really wrong for her. And what I realized is that the care around mental illness, this is to reference Artie Lang, who had a lot of criticisms with psychiatry in the 60s when there was a lot of radical thinking. And a friend of mine gave me his book, and it was really hard for me to read because I felt like I was personally being attacked by Artie Lang. But I've grown to recognize that it's true, that like the treatment of mental illness boils down a lot to power and control. When Giulia was psychotic, basically, I didn't trust her decision making, and her doctors didn't necessarily trust her decision making, but they did trust mine. So they put choices in my hands. And that means that Giulia didn't have a say in what was happening to her body and her mind, and when she was suicidal and depressed and all she wanted to do was drive to the Golden Gate Bridge and jump off, once again, I didn't necessarily trust her decision making, and neither did her doctors. And so once again, we would default to like trusting me, And when I think the resentment that I felt and the resentment that Giulia felt after the first episode really boiled down to this sense of unequal power. Like, our relationship had gone from one where, just like any adult relationship, you're trying to be equal partners, to a gross sense of inequality, right? And it was just, it was apparent, and it was hard to restore afterwards. So I think the first step was to become aware that this was a reality, like that my good intention caregiving was a part of this unequal power dynamic. So the first step was awareness. Okay, with that step, with that awareness, what do you do? The second thing that I really had to learn is what it means to listen. I actually just had a piece come out in The Guardian last week that is about this. You know, it's funny, when Giulia was hospitalized, I worked at a Benedictine school, and the opening lines of St. Benedict's rule is listen with the ear of your heart. And so at my school, we talked a lot about the importance of listening, and I thought I knew what it was to listen. But when my wife was talking to me about wanting to kill herself, I didn't listen. I tried to fix it. I tried to talk her out of it. I tried to come up with all the reasons why she shouldn't feel that way, which in a way is kind of rejecting that feeling, you know? And it took me, honestly, just fatigue. It just took me that having had this conversation with her saying, I'm suicidal, and me being told over and over and having to tell her over and over, this is why it's worth staying alive, that that I got to the point where I just would finally, she'd say these really dark things to me, and I'd look around and say, hey, we're in our living room, we're together, she can't actually hurt herself right now, so why do I have to talk her out of it? Why can't I just sit here and let her express what she needs to express? And that had a pretty big transformation on us, because I think she was able to feel like she felt validated, she felt heard. And so in learning to listen, I think we came upon what feels like to me the most important strategy that we learned out of trying to manage her illness, which is that we have a working plan for what to do in the event of a relapse. We put this together after the second episode. I learned about it from an organization called the Icarus Project, and they call it MAD Maps, but you can kind of call it whatever you want. But basically, we made a lot of, I think, inevitable mistakes about how to treat Giulia. I had a lot of meetings with her doctors where she was not there, talking behind her back. I signed off unquestionably on medication, no matter how much Giulia complained about the side effects. And after the first episode, as I said, our marriage went into a tailspin. Then we had this second episode, and kind of out of habit, we sort of repeated a lot of the mistakes of the first episode. So then it was like, okay, now that the diagnosis is bipolar disorder, now that we have to grapple with the reality that this could come back many, many times, we have to figure out how to go through crisis without it feeling so unequal and so controlling, and where I feel so unvalidated and unappreciated, you know? And so, but after her second episode, Giulia and I basically talked through all the details of what her episodes look like. The onset of psychosis, the admission into the hospital, the reality of her job, the reality of at this part we had a child, the offers of help that come from her parents and my parents. We basically had to say, like, okay, you're well now, you're doing great now, there's no depression or psychosis now. So now we can sort of trust each other's judgment and each other's ability to listen to each other and hear the hard things. And so basically went through this many month-long process of working out a plan for, if there was another episode, how would we respond? And what was really fortunate is that we had this plan in place by the time her third, and what to this point is her last episode. And we actually got to put that plan into effect. And I have to say, it was pretty remarkable. Giulia spent the least amount of time in the hospital compared to the other two. She had her shortest depression compared to the other two. She did not have to leave her job, something she had done with the other two. In fact, she resumed work fairly early. And so a lot of the big, quote unquote, mistakes that we had made of the first episode felt like they were being addressed because we had this plan in place. And so here we are It's been 2.5 years, almost 3 years since Giulia's last hospitalization. And you better believe we still have this plan. And it's something that we still talk about, because even though we had a plan for episode 3, there were still some things we didn't do right. And we know that because we processed it afterwards. And so if, again, with our talk being about what we learned as a couple through bipolar, it's that bipolar is a lifelong, illness. It's something that has a likely possibility to return and continue to impact your family. And I think the way we look at healthcare tends to be that, like, you just want to, quote unquote, you want to beat it. You want to fight it and cure it and fix it and never have to deal with it again. And if you actually address a relapse, it's almost like you're losing to the illness. But I actually think it's the exact opposite, that if you're prepared for the illness to come back, then that's your way of claiming victory over it. And that's your way of taking control over it, so that if it does come back in your life, it doesn't have to be so destructive and harmful to your relationships and the people that you love. So that, I think, those 3 things are really the biggest lessons that I've learned in our marriage. It's the reality from a caregiver, as I can admit, it's about power. I need to listen to her, and then we need to have a plan of how to address future relapses. So Giulia's going to chime in now with some of the things that she learned through this about how to keep the family going as best it can.
Yeah, for me, it was definitely to add to Mark's list, because I really believe everything that he said, especially tied to the listening piece, and it's something that I work on still very much with my relationship with Mark, is really listening to him, and when he's heard and his concerns, especially through my bipolar episodes. But my main thing is really about acceptance. It's accepting this diagnosis as part of who I am. Our book, we have a memoir, obviously, that came out in May, and the title of it is My Lovely Wife in the Psych Ward. And I remember at the beginning I was not okay with this title, because the psych ward is such a powerful, scary word, and do I want that associated with me? And it actually took a long time to accept that light and darkness within myself, the lovely and the psych ward. That is who I am. Both of those things are true, and they exist within me. And I learned that accepting that is the only way that you can truly love yourself, and you can truly love others, and really give to this world, and give back, and love your spouse. So I think it was a lot about me coming to terms with my diagnosis and my life journey. Like, it took such a different spin than I would have ever imagined. But at the same time, it's beautiful. I have a beautiful life. I get to, do a job that I love. I get to be a mom to a 5-year-old son, and I get to share our story with all of you. And that is such a beautiful thing that I never would have dreamt about for myself or my life. So I think that is my main lesson. It's like, if you are in a really dark place, keep going. There is going to be that light. There is going to be that lesson, and there is going to be that support that you need to get through some of the darkest days of your life. And I'm so grateful for my life, and I fight for my life every day. And I want to be here today, and I want to be the best mom that I can be, and I want to be the best wife that I can be. And that wasn't always the case. Sometimes I took Mark for granted, like, through the depression, through that time, the fact that he stuck by me, that is not a given. People leave these situations when they get scary, when they get really dark. People leave, and Mark chose to stay and be by my side, and that is so beautiful, and it's something that I can't ever forget about, and I have to continue to appreciate. So yeah, those are my lessons.
So, as we've referenced multiple times, we have a book out. This is the cover. It's published by HarperCollins. It came out on May 2nd. it's the same image from earlier that my dad took because my publisher thought it just evoked so much, and I agree. Um, and we wanted to, before we opened up to questions from the audience, we wanted to talk about why we wanted to write a book about this, right? These issues are so personal, and most people just keep them to themselves. And I think my answer to that, you know what, actually, Julie, why don't you start first? And then, okay, I'll go first, never mind. As I said earlier, when Julia was hospitalized, I felt super alone. You know, I'm a history teacher. I like to research and find answers. And so when she was, I remember being in the emergency room with them, you know, working on the paperwork to admit her, and I was on my phone trying to research what the heck was going on. And I found a lot of great resources for what was happening to her. But what I did not find was a lot of great resources for what was happening to me. I felt like the spouse side of the story was, no, I just couldn't find it. And I ended up feeling like, I knew it obviously wasn't the case, but I felt like I'm the only person in the world to be going through this, because I can't find anyone else to tell me about it, you know? And so once we got through her episode, and I don't know, I had never been a writer before, but I said, you know, Julia, what we've been through was really harrowing and really difficult, but I got to be honest, I think that since we're making it through, we could have the potential to help some people. And I think especially we could have the potential to help people who have been hospitalized and diagnosed like Julia has, but also to help some family members who maybe feel alone and don't feel like there's anyone that they can turn to and no one that they can ask for advice or even just read their experience. And so that was really the motivating force to write this essay for the Modern Love column in the New York Times, which I did at this point 5 years ago. No, even 6 years ago. And, you know, I submitted it not knowing what was going to happen, and it was really widely read. And I think that was a validation that I'm not the only person who loves someone with a mental illness, obviously. But most importantly, that other people like me were looking for someone to connect with. And then I wrote this magazine and article in Pacific Standard, which was longer and really became the basis of the book. And that one especially was well read. I mean, that had millions of reads within a week or two. And that's where it was like, okay, we have a story and a message that people are resonating with because there's so few out there talking about it. And so that, you know, it was difficult to write this book. I had to go and relive a lot of really hard moments from my life and try to put my authentic self into them. So it wasn't exactly easy. But so far with the book out over 2 months now, we've been really just humbled by the response, by people who have, you know, I get a lot of emails about my writing, and the ones that hit me the hardest, I distinctly remember this guy who said, hey, I'm literally emailing you from the emergency room, and my wife is psychotic. I don't know what's happening, and I Googled psychotic wife, and I came across you and your book and your article, and then he just launched into it. And honestly, that was like, I just started crying when I read that, because I felt like that's exactly why I wanted to do this, because I was that guy and I came up empty with this Google search, and now that guy has something where he can just have this little thread to grasp onto that hopefully gives him some tools, but also, most importantly, some hope that what's happening is really troubling and scary, but there's a way forward. So I think Julia spoke a little bit about her acceptance around being, I mean, because this is not my medical diagnosis, this is hers, so this is even more private, and I think by extension more courageous for her to be associated with this book. But I still wanted to make sure she had the chance to say why she wanted to have this book go public.
Yeah, we really shared our stories so that others would feel less alone and less scared. Ultimately, it's all about bringing more understanding to mental illness so that we can end the stigma. I always sign all of my little, social posts on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook with the hashtag end the stigma, because it's so universal. Like that is what we're trying to do with our story, is by putting it out there. Most of the comments that come back is gratitude. It's saying thank you for sharing this, because now I actually was able to share my story with my own family, that I am bipolar. Like, there's people out there that I haven't even been able to share their diagnosis with their own families. It shouldn't be that way. And so we really want to address mental illness with love, compassion, and understanding. And we feel that our memoir does a good job at bringing the awareness out there and being compassionate about mental illness. And so we just hope, that anyone can pick up this book and learn about bipolar or mental illness, about families and struggle. And it doesn't even have to be tied to mental illness. It could be a couple that, is going through cancer and the wife has chemo that has to go through it. We feel like this can reach, has a universal message, and it could reach a lot of people. And we're just so grateful to be here today with all of you to share our journey with you.
Yeah, and that's actually the note we want to end on, is how much we appreciate speaking hosted by the International Bipolar Foundation. We've done a bunch of book readings and interviews, and especially in the interviews, a lot of people get so curious about some of the sensational aspects of mental illness, like the delusions or the suicidal impulses. But I feel like we're here talking to an audience of kindred spirits, people for whom bipolar is a big part of their life, whether it's through their own diagnosis or a family member or a friend or whoever it may be. And it just, honestly, the chance to connect with an audience of fellow travelers is the one where I feel the most excited and empowered, because I just feel like you're the people for whom, honestly, we're like trying. This is why we're trying to share our story, to connect with people like you. So I know that Debbie has been facilitating questions. We have still about 15 minutes, so any questions that you all might have, hopefully you've been sending them in. Maybe we should have said that 40 minutes ago. But if you have any questions, you can email them in. I'm not exactly sure how the tech of that works out, but I think Debbie might have some to send over to ask us, and then we'll just kind of take it from there. Okay?
Yes, thank you both. Thank you. Thank you for sharing with us. And we do have a number of questions here, so I will just get started. The first question, I think, is a really important one and something that could be very helpful for everyone. You talked about a plan, having a plan. Do you have any suggestions as to how to get started, or any reference, resource tools that you went to get yourself started?
Yeah, so I think, again, I learned about the MAD map through the Icarus Foundation. So you can go check that organization out if you want to. They have some resources about it. But I think that what Giulia and I did, is the way we started is, after her second hospitalization, her doctor gave her a jar of Risperdal, which is the antipsychotic she takes, which she does not like at all, and said, all right, this is your emergency supply. And I realized that Giulia and I never actually defined what an emergency was. Like, what would have to be happening to get it that where we would both agree that she needed to take this medication, which she did not like. And so I was like, these pills are pointless if we don't actually have an idea for when we're going to actually get to that threshold where she's going to take them. And so I said, hey, we need to talk about those pills. And it did not go over well. She was like, don't you believe I'm strong enough to not have a relapse? And it turned into a really tense fight. And So I would say one strategy I recommend is if you have a difficult time working through this plan, get someone to mediate the conversation. We actually ended up meeting with Giulia's psychiatrist to say, hey, listen, we're trying to define what this crisis situation would look like in which Giulia would take her medication. I thought one night of no sleep, she's got to take a full dose. And Giulia was like, no way. I want to go 3 nights and take half a dose. And, you know, we needed the doctor to weigh in. But honestly, as soon as we figured out the first detail, it was like, okay, it's actually not impossible to come to an agreement about these really difficult things. And so that kind of opened the floodgates for us to figure out the other points of tension. You know, I can't really speak universally because I think each relationship is going to have their own points of tension. But I think for us, they were certainly around when to take medication, what to do about Giulia's job, because her job is so big in her identity. And like with her first hospitalization, I was in the one communicating with her job, and they actually presented me with a choice to either quit on her behalf or let them fire her. And they said, we don't think we should fire Giulia because that'll like be bad on her track record. So we think you should quit for her. And even though those were literally the only 2 choices, like Giulia really had a hard time accepting that I had quit her job for her, you know, and didn't ask her about it. And so we've made a lot of decisions around her job. We've definitely made a lot of conversation around our son because he was 5 months old when she was hospitalized for the second time, 2.5 years old at the third time, and now he's 5. And so we need to continually tweak our plan as he gets older and more aware and also has more autonomy. Like, I think eventually our plan is going to have to include him because right now we're really acting kind of as protective parents, as like what we think is best for him. But like, I think it's important that he gets to say what he thinks is best for him. I mean, that's kind of part of the listening component. So I would say, like, if you're considering, like, if you want to do one of these plans, which I could not more highly recommend, you got to first with sort of like a cataloging of what are your biggest points of tension? What are the things that are the hardest for you as a couple to talk about around these health issues, that as soon as you start, you feel your stomach tighten up and like the air gets sucked out of the room? Well, like, those are the things that you got to address, right? And start with one, and if you can find some success through one, you're going to find a whole ton of confidence that you'll be able to figure out the others as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that answer. The next question is, how many times has, Giulia, this is for you, how many times have your medications or treatment methods been changed by doctors until you found one that works for you?
I would say that after my first hospitalization, the first 9 months while I was in intensive outpatient care, like it was like a cocktail mix of going up and down on different medication, antidepressants, antipsychotics. Like, I feel like I have been on every single one. Right now, I have found what has worked for me. For my bipolar, I've been stable for the last couple of years, and I've been on the same medication. So I only actually, and I can share this, I only take lithium, and I have a really amazing psychiatrist that is also a mother who's so compassionate and loving, and she knows my anxiety anytime that we up or down the dose for lithium. But I know that I have the certain times of the year where I'm much more prone to relapse, and that is in the fall. All of my 3 episodes have happened in September, October, November. So I do heavy up on my dose in the fall to protect myself, and then I wean back down to my regular dose during the spring and summer. So that's kind of been what has kind of worked for me. But yes, I have been on every single medication, I feel like. And it was really frustrating. I remember there was one medication specifically where I gained 70 pounds in 6 weeks. And this is right after having come out of the psych ward for the first time. So then I find myself with my mind feeling broken, right? Because I have no idea what just happened to me. And then my body, which I was always really small, like ballooning and going up 6 sizes. So it's definitely was a frustrating process to go through, but I am so grateful and thankful of the medication I'm on, and I'm confident that I'm on the right dose and that I have the right team that really supports me through my life and being able to be the best as like my mom, as a mom, and also in my career, which are both very important to me.
The last thing I'd chime in before we get to the next question is like a little bit more detailed, because I was paying so much attention to the medicine as it was happening. Julia has been on 4 different antipsychotics and 3 different antidepressants, all in different quantity and in different pairings. And then finally, towards the end of that first 9 months, she was given lithium, and that turned out to be the thing that really turned her around, but they kept her on an antidepressant. When she got pregnant, they took her off lithium, kept her on the antidepressant. That may have, because again, they thought that this was major depression and not bipolar at that point. And then, since we're talking about medication, it's just worth chiming in and reminding people that it's like, even if you found the pill that works well for you, you still got to kind of track it. Julia was on lithium, on the prescribed dosage of lithium when her 3rd episode happened, but we had gotten a little complacent, and she hadn't taken blood work for a while. And as it turns out, like when she didn't have her first night of sleep and we went to her doctor, the first thing they ordered a blood sample, right? Like, what are your lithium levels? And even though she was on the right dosage, I guess her body had started to metabolize it at a different rate. And she was below the therapeutic level at that point. And so, especially if you can identify if there are triggers or times of year that are challenging, to just, check in with your medication. Be aware of, like, is it still working well? Like, have those conversations with your psychiatrist, just because I think being proactive around that can help to hopefully keep relapses at bay.
Wonderful. Thank you for that information. The next question is, I'm a wife with a husband diagnosed with bipolar, and he has had a number of psychotic episodes and hospitalizations, yet he has not accepted his diagnosis and doesn't take his medicine regularly. Do you have any suggestions as to how I can approach him to be compliant with medication?
This is, I'm just so overwhelmed with emotion. I don't even know where to get started. I don't know. I think you have to play the bad cop because you want to keep your husband safe. It's what I did for Julia's first episode. I think that through our trials and tribulations, I know that I'm really fortunate that it really only took 1 episode for Julia to understand that she did need her medication, and I know for some people it takes much more than that and a lot longer. I have friends who have seen family members have multiple cycles because they haven't gotten to that acceptance that Julia is at. And I know that acceptance is really one of the most important steps. And so I think that, it's kind of a bitter pill for you to have to swallow, but I do think it might mean just keep on playing bad cop and keep making sure he gets his pills, and then deal with the tension later, because eventually he's going to realize, at least I hope, that the pills allow him to be his best self. I think that's what Julia has recognized. Like, to be the best mom, best wife, best career woman, she needs to take her lithium. Without it, she has these instabilities which hold her back and prevent her from being able to be there all the time. And so, that's a hard one, but I think that would be my recommendation. And I just want to also wish you like a ton of love and luck, and hope you guys can hang in there.
Great, thank you. And the next question is specific to your plan in terms of when a spouse is away. For example, Mark, if you're away from Giulia and she was experiencing a stressful moment, if you're traveling for work or something, what do you have in terms of your plan to help Giulia in those times?
I think it's about the village approach as well. I mean, there's no question about it that I'm the most front and center in Giulia's recovery plan, but over time I've learned to let go of needing to be the center of her recovery program and instead trust the friends she's made along the way. I mean, I know that Giulia, through her hospitalizations and outpatient programs and through opening up, has made some really strong friendships with people who she can call during times of crisis. And sometimes even if I'm in the room with her, it's better for her to call a friend as compared to talk to me, just because even though we love each other very deeply, like, I've never actually experienced what she's experienced, and she can sometimes just have a deeper connection with someone who has. So I think also, like, the truth is, my job, I'm a teacher, I don't actually travel that much. And so we don't have to deal with these things individually too often, but I really just trust the friend support that she has and her doctor support to know that if there was a crisis and I'm not aware, and having seen Giulia go through this and being more proactive around taking care of herself rather than wishing that it wasn't part of her life and just, pushing the pills to the side, she's become so much more proactive that it's like, I think that obviously I want to be there, but in worst case scenario, Giulia could handle it until I am able to be there.
Great, thank you.
Debbie, if I can just
next...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but just in the interest of time, we probably only have time for maybe another question or two, because
okay.
We'll
make this our last question. So kind
Great.
of folds in last question / answer in terms of, you mentioned that Giulia has strong friendships, and have there been any difficulties around friendships given her diagnosis? And also, how do you keep the romance alive in your marriage when this thing's...
I'll talk about the romance, and then she can talk about the friendships. It was really hard to see Giulia romantically when she was so sick. We were eating out. We were like, I guess you could call them dates, but they weren't really dates, because like it was this like one-sided conversation just trying to keep her present. And I think what it took for me was just realize, like, it's like saying, like, if she was in a body cast, romance would not be my top priority, right? But then I think it would be okay that once she got better to say, hey, you know what? Like, now that we're both super healthy, like, it's important to reconnect romantically as a couple and not just in this caregiving dynamic. And so it was similar. Like, while she was in the hospital and then suicidal, I just kind of turned that switch off, But I think that after that, because we've had some of these, I think the process of working on this book, which I wrote but Giulia read every draft of, and all these really difficult conversations, I think in this sort of unexpected way, that's actually been a big way that we've been able to keep the romance alive. Because at the end of each conversation, no matter where it starts, if we actually see it through to its end, what we ultimately end up concluding is that we love each other and that we're trying to hang on for each other and for ourselves. And that may not be, a walk on the beach holding hands with sparkling blue waters, but that's a pretty romantic sentiment, And so I think that it's like kind of ironic, but like talking about the challenges of her illness have ultimately helped us to strengthen our love for each other and our, you know, our desire to stay together as a couple.
Yeah, and I mean, this memoir is very much, you know, it's a love story. Sometimes I see it as, I find it extremely sexy because it's like Mark writing, you know, a love letter to me, you know, because only by reading this book through his point of view and his perspective was I really able to understand like his loneliness or everything that he, you know, did as a father, like to Jonas when I was in the hospital, you know. I was able to really grasp that, like by reading this book. So I think there was nothing more romantic that he could have done for me.
And then there's another question about your friendships.
Yeah, back to your
question. Yeah, friendships for me, I'll talk about me personally, difficult at times, just because caregiving was so consuming. You know, I acknowledge that during her first episode, I was a husband, and that was pretty much it. I didn't have the capacity to be a brother or a son or a friend. I was just a husband. And in the second episode, I had to learn how to be both a husband and a father, because now it wasn't just Giulia, but it was also our son. And so the truth is like, I think that my family unit is really where I put the overwhelming majority of my energy. And as a result, I definitely have friends who I think are wonderful people, but I don't necessarily spend a lot of time with them. And I think that's something that I'm trying to do as we keep going through what's been a prolonged period of stability, is like, you know what, it's okay to step away from my family in order to pursue some of these friendships more. You know, I'm 35 now, and my two closest people in my life are my wife and my child, and I think that's great. But I also think that I need to have some buddies that I can go surfing with and mountain biking with, and not just do those activities alone like I typically do. You know, and so I think that's going to be a part of my life going forward, is to give myself the space to kind of pursue friendships more than I have over the last 8 years, with bipolar as such a big part of our life.
Yeah, and for me, some of my closest friendships I met after my diagnosis, after I became bipolar. These are friendships that I met like in the hospital or through friends of friends who later became mentors of mine as well. One specifically I have in mind, you know, she is bipolar, and she had her own battles 20 years ago being in the psych ward. And I remember coming out of the hospital and feeling so lost and alone. And she looked at me and she said, "You will be happy again." And I remember going on so many walks with her on the beach and trying so hard to believe this statement that she made. And looking back, you know, we're still very close all these years later, and she's still so important to me because of the role that she played. So I have to say, I have my group of friends that have known me, you know, since those Georgetown days, that I was this, you know, type A, like super achiever. And then I have my really close friends that I've really developed through this new journey of mine that I feel so privileged of knowing. And I feel that these friendships wouldn't have come in my life if we didn't have this connection, this really deep connection and understanding of mental illness.
Great, thank you both. And we will end on that question. And I just want to add that there has been an overwhelming number of folks are sending me messages through this portal, thanking you for sharing your story and how helpful this has been for them, knowing that they're not alone, and also some wonderful ways in which you have shared your the way you manage your life, and it's just been incredibly overwhelming. So thank you very much.
And thanks to everyone who took the time to join us this morning. And you saw, if you don't mind, I'll go back. You can find our book. You can go to my website. You can email me through there. We would love to be in touch, and just wish everyone the best. And sorry we didn't have the time to get to all the questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for your love and spending the morning with us today.
Absolutely. And just to remind everyone, this webinar has been recorded and will be archived on our website for your future viewing or reviewing or sharing with others. And everybody, make it a great day. We'll see you at the next webinar.
Cool. Thanks.
Bye-bye.